Hello everyone, welcome back to the second video discussing Pierce Conversion Infiltrator. In this particular video, I'm going to be focusing on two specific melee builds that I've found very effective. Alright, and I'm also going to address two things really quick first. Now, the first thing I want to address is in the previous video of this, I misspoke. I said that the 100% armor piercing wasn't a true piercing damage conversion. I was wrong. That is, in fact, 100% piercing damage. The second thing I want to talk about is, because I meant to talk about this in the previous video, but I did not. The reason why I don't... Well, I'm going to be talking about here the Unseeing Gaze set, right? Because this is one of the two melee builds that I find very effective with a Pierce conversion build. Although this is my least favorite. I'll talk about that in a little while. But, back to the point... Why don't I recommend, say, parts of this build? Because if you have... This is a 5-piece set, which includes 2 weapons. So if you're not using the weapons, it's a 3-piece set, where you're getting, double pierce damage, well, 100% pierce damage increase. Double pierce damage is a bit disingenuous, but anyways, plus 100% pierce damage and increased offensive ability. Why don't I recommend that you maybe go and equip these pieces? Well, as I've stated before... I'm really fond of green pieces because they can, in fact, drop with prefixes or suffixes that either can increase skills that you're using or provide you with more damage than what you're using, etc. While in total, when you're running the set here, the 3 pieces of the set, you get pierce damage on this, as well as on the torso piece and the amulet. If you're lucky, green pieces are better. If you're unlucky, or what I actually recommend more specifically is equip these unless you find a green piece that's better. Now, granted, these are at level 94, so in the, prior to these pieces of equipment, you're going to primarily be running off of green pieces anyways. Maybe you temporarily equip some epic or legendary piece of armor that gives you pierce damage, but in the long term, everything you equip before level 94 is going to be temporary, really. It's just a matter of how temporary it is. At level 94, in enough time, given enough time, you are going to find something better on a green piece. It's just a matter of when, right? So what I typically do with epic and legendary pieces, unless I'm very specifically building around them, like I am talking about with the Mythical Nadaan's Reach, or what I'm going to be talking about later on, focusing around the Unseeing Gaze set, because this is the most effective dual-wielding Pierce conversion build that I've ever played with. Unless you're focusing around it, a lot of the times, green pieces will pull through and be more effective. Alright? But, having said that and corrected myself from last video, let's talk about Mythical Nadaan's Reach. Now, this is 100% piercing damage. This gives you absolutely massive increases in pierce damage. This also gives you massively increased bleed damage with increased duration, and we also, of course, have the elemental damage conversion here, just like with the Messenger's repeater. The thing is, though, with the Infiltrator, very specifically, these rounds, right, are specifically ranged. We can't use these with melee, so that's not really going to functionally happen, right? These, of course, will still be converting that cold damage from dual wielding with the dual wielding, but this is a melee dual wielding. This doesn't affect two-handed weapons, so that's not going to help us here either. So, for whenever I approach a Pierce conversion build with the Infiltrator and I'm running this, this elemental damage means diddly squat, right? What is also very effective, though, is healing effects are increased, so this is usually my go-to when I'm running hardcore, just because of this. This helps you survive a little bit longer, and we also get bonuses to Ring of Steel, which I'll talk about the benefits of that in a bit. But this is actually fairly interesting, along with very specifically +2 to all skills in Inquisitor, which also gets fairly interesting. Now, approaching this build, this is the build where I usually run Amarasta's Blade Burst, alright? Now, obviously, we're not converting that cold damage, right? Technically speaking, we're converting some of it because you are hitting them with the weapon here, right? We are actually doing the weapon, theoretically speaking, here. Not actually, because this cold damage is technically separate, but because it's not activating off of default weapon attacks. But, back to the point, this is temporary. It really is, alright? In the early game, you need something that hits hard and can wipe out large amounts of enemies, but with the melee build, this is much more consistent, okay, in terms of impacting who you want it to impact. So, for melee builds in the early game, when you're just trying to slap your way through that early portion of the game, I prefer this on melee builds over the Word of Pain, as I talked about in the previous video. We don't care about this conversion, we don't care about this. This is temporary, because as I stated in the previous video, this eventually increases our cold and acid damage, things we don't care about. We only want this temporarily, so we can survive, right? Basically. I do usually pick up Veil of Shadow afterwards, because this also contributes to helping us survive. For the Inquisitor, I don't really pick up that much out of Inquisitor here. In fact, a majority of the melee two-handed weapon actually is Nightblade. Alright, there are a couple of reasons for this we'll talk about. You probably can guess some of these, but anyways, let's continue on. Now, once you get up to this point here, this is where you drop Amarasta's Blade Burst, and you go full throttle into Phantasmal Blades. Now, the reason why Phantasmal Blades, and I mentioned this in the previous video as well, the reason why Phantasmal Blades are better in the melee build is pretty specifically because you don't have a default ranged attack, so you need something ranged, and Phantasmal Blades has the great benefit of being something you can throw out there pretty consistently, right? It's only a 3-second recharge, so you can throw these out pretty often, and it's absolutely lovely. We do not use Frenetic Throw, because that's converting out our piercing damage to Vitality, which we don't want. But we absolutely want Phantasmal Blades here, alright? Now, because of the fact that this is a two-handed weapon, and we get +2 to all skills in Inquisitor, unlike with the previous build, where you could choose your preference of Pneumatic Burst and Word of Renewal, it was your choice between the two of them, they were roughly as effective. This is much less true with this particular build, the Nadaan's Reach build, because Pneumatic Burst does not get 2 bonus points, but Word of Renewal does, alright? And in fact, once you get Phantasmal Blades, and you're starting to use those pretty effectively, this is generally when I run up to Word of Renewal. I'll also often go all the way up to here and grab Word of Arms, because again, we are using a two-handed melee, but this is actually increasing further, right? We're getting more healing out of this. You can see as an indication here where you're getting another percentage, you're getting another 80 health. This comes out pretty close to 20% health plus 1,000-ish. I can't remember the numbers specifically off the top of my head. You're getting 20% increase in movement speed, right? Word of Renewal is absolutely better than Pneumatic Burst with Nadaan's Reach. Alright, just very specifically. But we still keep going with this. In fact, obviously we get Knight's Chill because Pierce resistance down. Lovely time. I don't necessarily always grab Heartseeker. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. The increased bleeding duration really isn't that big of a deal. The increase in bleeding damage can be, but it's down to your preference. This is a preference thing. It is nice that the blades will pierce through enemies. That does really help. The conversion to health can help. If I'm running hardcore, I'm more likely to be running this. Alright? In a lot of other situations, this is going to be down to your personal preference. I will say, though, that this is, at least the healing portion of this is a little less useful if you're running a mob that increases enemy stat numbers, because you're doing less damage, obviously, because their defenses are increased, so you're not really healing as much. If you're building into this for the bleed damage, then I would say, yeah, go for it, or the piercing through. Still worth it, but if you're looking to heal off of this, not really that big of a deal. That matters in hardcore a little bit. Outside of that, the healing doesn't really make a huge difference because, again, you are running a little bit of a higher word of arms than normal. Experiment with it and see if you like it. Some people do, some people don't. For me, it really depends. I'm going to take the points out of this for this example here because more often than not, I don't run this, alright? For the same reason, I don't run Nether Edge. In fact, I recommend you not do Nether Edge at all. This is just chaos and cold damage, which we don't care about. At the very least, we are increasing our bleed damage, so Heartseeker has some utility here. Like I said, if you like the Pierce, you like the well, I won't say the Pierce because that's not quite exactly accurate. If you like the punch through and you like the bleed, absolutely go for this, but don't necessarily build this for the heal. If the healing off of this is the 10% conversion is what you're looking for here, I'd recommend not bothering. Alright? What we do want is Ring of Steel. Alright? Now, obviously, first off, we get bonuses to Ring of Steel for, you know, having Nidon's Reach equipped, but more importantly with this is the increase in the target area. Alright, and of course the increase in damage is really nice, but we have an increase in target area here, which means this actually is 6 meters, which still isn't quite as nice as the 10 meters this gets up to, but we also get much more damage out of this, and we get some additional bleed damage on this, which is really, really nice. We love this. We love to see it. And in fact, Circle of Slaughter is equally as effective. We actually typically run all the way up to here with this, and grabbing this is absolutely fantastic. Now, besides doubling the pierce damage this skill is doing by itself, we also have additional bleed damage, which is great, and we have a roughly 1/3 time of enemies. They use the term fumble. I hate that word. It's basically just reducing their accuracy to miss you, right? Functionally is how that works. Fumble is not quite as accurate. Again, Ring of Frost, we're converting out our piercing damage. We don't want this. But this is lovely, alright? And this slaps significantly harder than Horn of Gandar. Now, Horn of Gandar was really nice with the ranged build because we were, again, ranged, so the 10-meter target area was really important, alright? Very important, and besides, with a ranged build, Horn of Gandar's primary purpose was to get melee enemies off our backs while we were dealing with other problems. For Nightblade, because we're melee, we already have Phantasmal Blades to deal with ranged enemies, and actually building Heartseeker does help with this, alright? But we're already going to be in melee range a lot of the time, and as a result, we're going to be surrounded a lot of the time. So Ring of Steel, even if you didn't have the increase in target area from Nidon's Reach, Ring of Steel would still be better off because you're getting concretely a stun, basically forcing enemies off of your back in the closer melee range. Yes, you confuse enemies here. Yes, you have reduced target damage here on Horn of Gandar. I almost called it Nidar, but I knew that was wrong. On Horn of Gandar. But for this, because this scales off of weapon damage and Nidon's Reach being a melee two-handed weapon hits harder than Messenger's Repeater, this goes so much farther, and a lot of people forget this. This is a 260% increased damage off of your weapon. This is 260% increase off of this alone. Alright? This slaps. Gandar does scale off of weapon damage, but not by as much. For Messenger's Repeater, which is a two-handed ranged, which still hits harder than a one-handed range, obviously, but two-handed range doesn't hit quite as hard as two-handed melee. So the damage difference here really makes up for the shorter distance, and again, we are actually hitting a 6-meter target area, which is better than the baseline, and only 4 meters out from, or closer than Horn of Gandar, right? So we're not losing that much range with Nadaan's Reach, so this goes so much farther for the Nadaan's Reach. I'm confusing Gandar and Nadaan. I knew I was going to do that. But we also have a couple of other options. We have a couple of other things we need to talk about. Now, you might be wondering, well, Professor, why not run Shadow Strike? We have a melee weapon. This does pierce damage. True, it does cold damage. But we could use this to close the distance. This is true. And if you want to put a single point in this just to close distance, that is often what I'll sometimes do. I don't necessarily want Shadow Strike for its damage output. I want Shadow Strike for its near teleportation. It's functionally not actually teleportation. You just run really fast. It's kind of silly. But I tend to put a single point in this just to close distances. Again, we are melee. We want to close that distance as quickly as possible because the more time we spend running from target to target, is more time we're getting shot at or in area effects or whatever. So having a single point in Shadow Strike really is great for countering this, but I don't really recommend investing too heavily in this because only half the damage is, well, technically the weapon damage is obviously going to be piercing because the weapon is piercing, but only half of the non-weapon damage is piercing. You've got a decent amount of cold damage there, which we don't really care about. We're not converting all of that. I just find that Ring of Steel and good old regular slapping attacks tend to be more effective. Just put in the 1 point for the teleport. There's not really any need to go up to justifiable ends, because that's just poison damage. There's not really any need to go to Nightfall. That's just more cold damage. If you really like Shadow Strike, can Shadow Strike be effective? Absolutely. Yes, it can. If you really like Shadow Strike, put the points in. I personally only stick in the 1 point because I'm busy running off of Ring of Steel, Circle of Slaughter, Phantasmal Blades, and it's still very effective to run up here and grab Aura of Conviction. Because, again, we don't have an exclusive skill. We are getting an increase in pierce damage here. We are getting the very useful Cunning, which, again, increases our damage. And if you really want, you can run Vigor. Again, on Hardcore, I recommend this. If you're not on Hardcore, that's totally down to your preference. But, actually, we're going to go ahead and run this. And just because we have so many spare points right now. Because right now, the thing is, the two-handed build really is much more straightforward, right? And that's why I've been talking a lot about things you could do if you really want to. It's very easy, because right now we have 68 points, and this is the absolute minimum that I always build on this, okay? That is what I'm establishing right here. This is my baseline for a Nadaan's Reach build. Alright, these are the minimum skills I run. I run full Veil Shadow, full Night's Chill, full Phantasmal Blades, always. I always max Ring of Steel, I always max Circle of Slaughter, I always have at least 1 point in Shadow Strike, I always work my way up to Aura of Conviction, because it's just awesome. And I always have Word of Renewal with Word of Arms. This is my minimum. Which is why I've been talking so much about, oh, you could do this if you want, you could do this if you want. Melee builds are a lot more straightforward, because you don't have to. Your primary worry is ranged enemies, which we have resolved. I sometimes go into Heartseeker if I'm having crowd control problems, because this does punch through, right? This is vital, actually, by the way. I didn't mention this earlier. This is vitally important if you're running a mod that increases enemy group numbers, because you have to punch through and hit way more ranged enemies in those situations. Depending on the mod, how much the mod increases enemy group numbers by depends on the mod. But if you are running increased enemy group numbers, this becomes a necessity. Outside of that, this is a preference. Okay? For the Inquisitor, Vigor is a necessity on Hardcore. Outside of that, it's a preference, right? I like Deadly Aim, another optional thing. Again, Shadow Strike, if you want to run full Shadow Strike, you absolutely can. Throw that in there if you want to. You can run Deadly Aim, like I said. I typically do, because, again, the constellations for Pierce conversion builds, whether you're melee or ranged, doesn't really change. What constellation skills you use changes. The dynamic changes a little bit there. I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's the same constellations, but what skills you pull from them does change. But Deadly Aim I really like. And quite frankly, what's really interesting is there is a way you can kind of break melee with this build that not a lot of people talk about, okay? Now, keep in mind, Ring of Steel has a stun for 1.5 seconds. Horn of Gandar confuses targets for 2.5 to 6 and reduces their damage by 5 seconds. This has a 4.5 second recharge. Alright, this has a 3 second recharge. If you really want to, and I've done this before, and it's very interesting, and there are some enemies that are immune to this strategy, by the way, obviously, but a lot of the grunts in the game are susceptible to this. So if you're running hardcore, or literally any mod that makes enemies more numerous or more difficult to deal with, this can be really substantial. Blast Horn of Gandar. Alright. And then count out 3 seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Blast Ring of Steel. You're waiting 1.5 more seconds for this to regenerate, and the reason why you count out the 3 seconds is because your targets are confused for a minimum of 2.5, so for half a second, at worst, enemies are going to be aware again and attacking you, right? So at minimum, half a second. And then you've got 1.5 seconds left for this to recharge. This stuns enemies for 1.5 seconds with a 3 second skill recharge. By the time the enemies around you are no longer stunned, Horn of Gandar is back up. Blast that out, count the 3 seconds. Stun them. Second and a half later, blast out the horn. Rinse and repeat. Obviously, this does very little for bosses. Very obviously. But in group situations, this can effectively nullify all, not all, a majority of melee enemies you're going to be confronted with. Alright? And you're only really going to have to deal with the ones that I've found are most consistently not affected by this strat are the really giant guys, the ethereal guys whose names escape me at this moment. You know the ones I'm talking about. Heroes, obviously, sometimes are immune to this. Depends on the hero individually. If you're running a mod with increased enemy defenses, by the way, more of them are going to be immune to this. But a lot aren't at base game. Pretty much any flunky, not even going to hurt you. Right? This is a really great strategy. And if you do put in the points for Shadow Strike, you can use Shadow Strike to pinpoint assassinate anyone who is immune to this. Alright? Because remember, you're doing 300% of your weapon damage on top of the pierce damage. Your weapon does pierce damage. You're getting all these pierce damage increases. This skill, if you do max it, is 100% going to slap. It really is. Okay? I don't necessarily always use this, but it is very, very potent at the end of the day. Alright, yeah, you're doing some cold damage, that doesn't matter. But this strategy here can very much trivialize a majority of the melee you're going to be doing. Alright? You have 7 spare skills. You don't even necessarily need Heartseeker for this. Although Heartseeker, when you have enemies confused and you're waiting, you're counting out your 3 seconds, throw out a Heartseeker to kill some ranged enemies. Very effective. Or, if you want to, you can actually just disengage from the group if you don't have Heartseeker and just fling some Phantasmal Blades anyways, right? Either one works very effectively. If you want to put these 12 points somewhere else, you absolutely can. Don't feel like obligated to Heartseeker. The last 7 points I'll typically run on Phantasmal Armor because whenever I do run this strat, usually it's also in a situation in which I want to not die. So Phantasmal Armor is often going to be really nice for these situations anyways. So that's a lot of what I run with, but if you prefer, say, Blade Barrier, that is also nice. If you somehow goof this combo, or if you're taking a lot of damage, you can bust out the combo Blade Barrier, right? That can be very effective and heal yourself up that way. That's really effective. Let's have a quick conversation about Blade Trap, because if you don't want to break melee on enemy mobs, you can run Blade Trap. Now, the interesting thing about Blade Trap, let me pull the points out of Gandar here for demonstration purposes, and pull the points out of Shadow Strike. Blade Trap is interesting because, well, I don't use Blade Trap a lot because you're in melee. There's not a whole lot of situations in which you're going to be throwing down a Blade Trap when you have access to at least 1 point in Shadow Strike and teleporting there, basically, anyways, right? You're not really seeing a lot of situations in which Blade Trap is hugely useful here. Even if you run all the way to Devouring Blades, which does increase your Pierce and Bleed, does convert some of this, right? It does, in fact, heal you to some extent. But the primary issue is you can throw this down and it's supposed to work kind of like a piercing version of a pierce bleed version of like one of the runes here. It's a trap-like idea, like the Rune of Haggarad or the Rune of Kallistor. It doesn't work exactly the same way, obviously, but it's still a trap-type item. But that's only really predominantly useful with ranged builds. Yes, you can use it in melee, but then why would I want to use Pierce Trap in melee when, for the same points, I can instead invest in Shadow Strike, which is also pulling my weapon damage in here. Alright, any situation in which Blade Trap can be useful for a melee character, Shadow Strike is better. Ring of Steel is better. Alright? I don't use this with melee builds for that reason. Because, yeah, great. Decreased defensive ability. Oh, wonderful. Now I can convert some of this attack damage into health. But that attack damage into health is still not scaling off my weapon. Right? This scales off my weapon. This scales off my weapon. For Pete's sakes, I can run Phantasmal Blades, right? Which also runs off my weapon. Not as much, I'll give you that. But it still runs off my weapon. This does not scale with my weapon. This does not scale with your weapon. This doesn't scale with any weapon. This is flat damage, and while you can obviously increase this through equipment and constellations, that's very true, at the end of the day, it's still not going to hit as hard as Shadow Strike, as Ring of Steel, as Phantasmal Blades. It's just not going to compare. It never is going to compare. It has some utility with ranged builds, but because we're also running Inquisitor, if you wanted that, as I mentioned in the previous video, if you wanted a trap-like item, Rune of Haggarad is much better for the same purpose. For Infiltrator, I've never used Blade Trap, except in experiments, and all of these experiments have proven that Blade Trap, compared to all the other tools you have access to, is just not as effective. Okay? And even in situations where, oh, boy, I can convert this attack damage to health, just get Blade Barrier instead. It's more consistent healing. Alright? I just don't know what else to tell you. Honestly. For Infiltrator, I've never encountered a situation in which I liked Blade Trap. With other combinations, it can be effective in certain circumstances, but for Infiltrator, honestly, just take the pass. But these are what I really like. Alright, this is the skills that I really like to run here. I'm just going to go on ahead and bring the break melee setup back here. Yeah, run Phantasmal Armor. Now, I like Phantasmal Armor, by the way, over Blade Barrier. Again, if you prefer Blade Barrier, run that. But I prefer Phantasmal Armor because it's giving me, again, reduced freeze, reduced petrify. It's giving me pierce resistance. It's giving me armor. We already have a great heal on Word of Renewal. By the way, this increases the health, obviously, because you have +2 to all Inquisitor skills. This also, by the way, I actually forgot to mention this totally and completely. The confusion lasts for longer with the +2 to all Inquisitor skills. This is even more pierce damage, right? This actually turns out to be like, I think it's 103%, if I'm remembering. 102 or 103%. I can't remember off the top of my head. I do wish that this allowed you to overextend. I know that with the, I could theoretically do the... Actually, we can do this. I can actually show you. I forgot about this. I tell you, my head cold really blasted my brains out. Really? Alright. Thank you. Yes. Back in here. There we go. Now you can see. 2.7 seconds. Here you have the 19%. It's still 19%. Right? I was slightly off on that because my brain cramped. 102. I was correct on that. Good on me. 2.7 confusion here. It's just... Oh, by the way, you can actually see the stats on this now. Absolutely insane. Absolutely fantastic. Right? And keep in mind, the reason why this, by the way, I'm not sure if you know this, the reason why the item skill modifiers are separated here is because Ring of Steel is also being boosted by 4 points, so they wanted to just make sure you understood what was because of the item skill modifiers and what was because of just the increased skill points. Boom. That's a lot of damage, right? And of course, you have the pierce resistance here. And you have the increased pierce damage here, of course. Now for devotion, which we're going to get into, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the same constellations, so I'm not going to go too hard on the constellations here. I'm actually just going to talk about the same skills that I talked about before. The only real difference here is what I assign them to and which ones I prefer. Now, I'm really fond of Assassin's Mark on Ring of Steel, personally. I recommend against running Assassin's Strike on Phantasmal Blades, because that crit might... You're not really looking to necessarily focus in on the enemy ranged at that particular moment in time. So if you pop a Assassin's Mark on an enemy with Phantasmal Blades, it's really not going to do you that much good, right? I do recommend, whether it's Shadow Strike or Ring of Steel or Horn of Gandar, I recommend Ring of Steel or Horn of Gandar, because if you're in a situation in which you're surrounded and you blast out either Ring of Steel or Horn of Gandar, you can just turn around and start smacking that fool down really quick, alright? That's why I prefer Ring of Steel for this, because Ring of Steel has that smaller radius that it hits, so you can reach that target a little bit faster, or if there's multiple targets, you can bounce faster between the two of them. That's why I prefer Ring of Steel over Horn of Gandar for Assassin's Mark, okay? That is just what I've found more effective. Now, gotta bring back a lot of these constellations here. This one, we'll talk about that in a bit. However, I will mention that I am much more fond of Blades of Wrath on this, alright? And typically when I Blades of Wrath with this, I am very specifically looking to Horn of Gandar. We're already, again, it's a similar kind of thing. We blast out the horn, get a critical, blast out some blades. Very fond of this. Now, I'm more fond of this than the Shifting Sands, because with ranged, in a decent number of situations, enemies are coming at you from a sort of an arc in front of you a lot of times. They're not coming at you from all directions. But with melee builds, especially if you're running Shadow Strike to teleport into the midst of enemies to close that distance faster, you're often going to find yourself surrounded. So the Blades of Wrath are actually more significant than the Shifting Sands. The Shifting Sands, right, is a much smaller radius, which is fine for ranged people who are using this as a sort of stopgap, right? They're using this to clear out the area around them. For melee, we're getting shot by enemies at a distance, so the Blades of Wrath with their longer distance, or the longer range, excuse me, are going to be more potentially useful. Alright? Just right off the top, okay? Just my personal preference. Again, if you like the Sands over the Blades of Wrath, you absolutely can go for the Sands. But I do prefer, with the melee build, the Blades of Wrath. It is also for this reason that I also like the Living Shadow much more on melee. I don't always necessarily run the Living Shadows. Sometimes I use Falcons, sometimes I use the Shadows. Alright? But the benefit here with the Living Shadows, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Shadows spawn next to you, which, for ranged, means that they're wasting some of those seconds that they're alive getting to the target. But when you're a melee build, that doesn't matter. They're right there. They're ready to pop attacks. It's absolutely great. I tend to run Living Shadows on melee builds in hardcore. You are getting some of that attack damage being converted, which is really important. Very great for you, right? This also can be really helpful on any mod that increases enemy group numbers. You have a lot more targets to deal with, and the Living Shadows can really help you clear out the area a little bit more, which, again, is very helpful. In any situation that isn't those two, I do tend to run the Falcons, because, again, that is a ranged projectile, another ranged projectile that I'm sending out to help deal with the torrent of ranged goons shooting me. So for me, it really depends, but I am much more prone to using Living Shadows on hardcore or any mod that increases enemy group numbers. For any one that increases enemy stats or the base game, I prefer Falcons. Alright, for those specific reasons. Otherwise, the constellations here are identical, right? The only real difference, like I said, is what skills I choose to use. But that's not all, folks. Because now, actually, let's undo the class really quick. Because now we have to talk about the second melee build that I find very effective, the Unseen Gaze Complete Set. Now, unlike with Nidon's Reach, which changes elemental damage attached to the weapon, any skill that scales off of default weapon attacks, anything you attach to the weapon as a component, which, by the way, why would you attach an elemental component to this when you can just attach a piercing one? But that's a conversation for a different day. Anyways, this actually converts a percentage of our cold damage to piercing damage, so we do have that sort of baseline here. Alright, there's not really... Actually, I don't think there's any other conversion here right off the top. No, not really. My main problem with this is, of course, decreased armor piercing. Right, obviously only 40% of that damage is going through as piercing, 40% of this is going through as piercing. Even when I was mistaken on armor piercing, it still mattered because I was obviously punching through armor less, right? So, I've talked about this one third because primarily due to this build is odd. Because on the one hand, you're attacking faster, you're attacking more often, you're dual wielding. And you have a lot of nice Pierce and Bleed increases. You have the really actually quite effective Eye of Thaddeus here, which is great. Now you may have noticed, and I haven't talked about this heavily on the Nadaan's Reach build I just talked about, but Nadaan's Reach builds, as you probably anticipated, typically go for, we've got the, of course, actually let me bring this back up here really quick, because I didn't heavily talk about this, but you've got 25% Pierce resistance here, and of course you have the 32% Pierce resistance here. So the Nadaan's Reach is only running correctly off of 57% Pierce resistance reduction, which might concern you because when you compare that to the Messenger's repeater, that can get up to, very easily, 92% if I remember the number correctly off the top of my head. True. But also remember that Nadaan's Reach as a weapon hits harder than the Messenger's repeater. So, and again, you can run Ring of Steel, which scales off of weapon damage quite substantially, and you can also use Shadow Strike as well. So while we lose the Pierce resistance from Word of Pain all the way to Death Sentence, because we're not converting that damage with Nadaan's Reach, so it becomes much weaker. Yes, we are reducing Pierce resistance, but this is a significantly weaker skill for Nadaan's Reach. We're hitting a lot harder, so we don't need quite as much Pierce resistance to deal similar levels of damage. The exception to this would be if we're running a mod with increased enemy resistances. That does get a bit problematic, but outside of that very specific modded scenario, you're going to be, in most situations, doing pretty similar levels of damage, if not slightly more, depending on the enemy's baseline Pierce resistance. But what we also have here is an additional 15%, because quite frankly, with the dual wielding, we still want Knight's Chill. We're still obviously looking to get Assassin's Mark. That doesn't change. But the Unseen Gaze does have the benefit of further Pierce resistance. Alright, so now we're talking about 72% Pierce resistance, putting it right between Nadaan's Reach and the Messenger's Repeater in terms of reducing enemy Pierce resistance. And once again, this is based on critical attack, not 100% on critical attack, but we're attacking more often, or faster, technically speaking, so that's not as much of a problem, right? So once again, even with this build here, we still really like Deadly Aim, alright? So this is still really quite effective. Alright, and even still, a lot of the times, we still want to run all the way up to, at least on paper, Aura of Conviction. Whether or not you actually want to go all this way really depends on you. There is actually a caveat here with the Unseen Gaze, but I'll get to that in a second. For now, at the very least, I will say, and I will recommend, that at the very least you should be looking to get to Deadly Aim, because that will really help you trigger both your constellations, as we've talked about before, and also the Eye of Thaddeus. Okay? But besides, we have this bonus here, but that's not really significant, right? The problem I have, the primary issue I have with this build, is the skills it enhances. Okay? Let me talk about this, because this is a bit of a pet peeve. You can see we have an increase to Blade Spirit, alright? We have increases to Death Sentence. A lot of Blade Spirit increases, right? Blade Spirit, Death Sentence, Knight's Chill, which we already like anyways, Deadly Aim, which we already like anyways, Knight's Chill, great, right? Lovely. The crux of the issue is that putting all these points in here for Death Sentence is not that important. Yes, we're reducing Pierce resistance. That's great. We're also doing a lot of elemental damage, but we're only converting 30% of the cold here on that. And that is it. And that's not a lot. I will say, and the reason why I've saved this for last is because, and I mentioned this in the description of the Messenger's Repeater build. The dual-wielding Unseeing Gaze. See, I have one benefit as a guy on the internet talking about Grim Dawn builds. I have access to people who play this game with me. Mostly family, who also love this game. The Unseeing Gaze build that I'm about to talk about is substantially more effective when playing with friends, because they can help reduce enemy elemental resistances. They might even be able to increase your elemental damage depending on what they're building. For example, if you have an Arcanist on your team, they can increase your elemental damage. So Death Sentence, while you by yourself, as a single player, this isn't going to hit that hard. And maybe you want to build this for the Pierce resistance anyways. And the ability itself is just hitting like an absolute wet noodle. With friends, this actually, if you're comboing with your friends, this can actually do a decent amount of damage and provide your friends with decreasing enemy Aether resistance and Chaos resistance, right? Again, if you have at least one friend and they're running Arcanist and literally whatever else, you can stretch this quite a bit farther. But by yourself, this is a really interesting problem of, yeah, sure, we can absolutely boost Death Sentence all day long, right? And if we actually go on ahead and really quickly change this, we have, because I want you to actually see, and I didn't bother doing this with the Messenger's Repeater because, quite honestly, the you're not letting me save this? What are you doing? Oh, that's because, whoops. That was the Nadon page. Nadon. There we go. The Nadon tab. There we go. But the reason why I didn't do this with the Messenger's Repeater, sorry, I had a brain cramp there, is primarily because that's a green weapon. So what that specifically winds up having on it is going to change depending on how lucky you are and everything else, right? But with the blue and the purple items, it's obviously more consistent. But what I want to specifically do is demonstrate that, yeah, you're doing some decent elemental damage here. You get really nice Pierce resistance out of this, do not misunderstand me. But it's also a lot of skill points to dedicate to this, and you want to max this out for the Pierce resistance because there's literally no other point by yourself. But with friends, this becomes substantially more significant, okay? Yes, to some extent, even when you're on a single player, it is going to slow enemy attack. Yes. It is going to reduce enemy health regeneration. Yes. It is going to help you with ranged enemies because it is going to give ranged enemies a 32% chance to whiff. Yeah. Well, no, that's actually misstated. There's a 32% chance that a ranged enemy is going to whiff all of their shots in 1 second. Most enemies don't have more than a second rate of fire anyways, so typically they'll... It functionally is almost a 32% chance to whiff their next shot, basically. Not always, but that's... you know. I'm phrasing it oddly, but 32% chance of impaired aim for 1 second is often only enough time for them to whiff one ranged attack. But yeah, this, in single player, this is a lot of skill points to dedicate just to getting some Pierce resistance and a really weak attack. Okay? You still can. And I'll talk about what you can do with these skill points instead if you don't want to, but this is an option. We're going to leave this set up here just so you can see that in action. Of course, you have the increased Pierce resistance here as well, which is absolutely fantastic. But we also have, of course, and this is where things get dicey, all these points to go into up here for Blade Spirit. Now, you'll notice we've spent spent a lot of points. Right? We still want Phantasmal Blades, though, by the way. Phantasmal Blades is still something you really, really want. Whether or not you decide to go Death Sentence, whether or not you decide to devote all of these points to going into Blade Spirit, you still will want Phantasmal Blades. A lot of times, you'll still want at least 1 point in Shadow Strike. I almost never put more than 1 point in this on the dual-wielding build. On the two-handed melee, this can be really effective, right? This will absolutely slap with a two-handed melee. With a dual-wielding, this is running off of specifically, if my memory serves me correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, this chooses your right-hand weapon and runs off of that for the increase in weapon damage. This doesn't hit as hard. Alright, still useful for zapping to an enemy and slapping him in the face, but it doesn't hit as hard. You also absolutely want Pneumatic Burst, because you can actually get the 3-second reduction in recharge in the health regeneration here, making this a 5-second heal. This will heal you every 5 seconds. Whenever I run Pneumatic Burst with Breath of Bolgathian, which I just butchered that pronunciation, I apologize for that, but I put this on my right click, so I can just, anytime I need healing, right click, boom. I can run this every 5 seconds, it increases my attack speed. Absolutely, I'm having this on all the time. I have a flow state with this, where I just, every 5 seconds, automatically, right click, right click, right click, no problem. Great time. Get in the zone, right-click every 5 seconds. My ability to time things on every 5-second increments, thanks to this skill, is incredible. But raving about Pneumatic Burst with Breath of Bolgathian aside, you also obviously want dual blades, because you're increasing that pierce damage, or getting flat pierce damage. It's a lovely time. The question with this build comes down to how much more of this chain do you want? That's what it comes down to a lot of the times. Do you want Bolgathian's Shears? Personally, let me tell you, yes you do. I always get this. You get a chance of a stun, because it's 22% chance to be used. You get bonus pierce damage, good scaling off of weapon damage, hits multiple enemies. Do I do Hidden Hand? No. Don't get Hidden Hand. This converts out your pierce damage, and you can see that right here, right? And it's not worth Amaras's quick cut here, because this pierce damage is partially getting converted, right? Not even a single point. Not even a single point, because when you are running the Unseeing Gaze, you can see where this jumps. If it was just like the 1 point, maybe you could get away with this. I still wouldn't recommend it. But with the Unseeing Gaze equipped, you're jumping right to 15% of your pierce damage being converted to acid, which is not what you want. That is not what you want. Don't do it. Stick to Bolgathian's Shears. Stick to dual blades. That works. But now we come back to the question. Do you want Death Sentence? And this is going to come down to your personal preference. Again, if I'm playing with family or friends, I will absolutely get Death Sentence. This is just gross. Single player, I typically don't get this. It's a lot of point investment. Yes, the Pierce resistance is really nice. That is very true. But on the other hand, this is a lot of point investment. I still, when I'm doing dual wielding build with the Unseeing Gaze, I still really like Ring of Steel. I still really like Circle of Slaughter. I'll actually usually pull the points out of this really quick. I still really like Ring of Steel and Circle of Slaughter, because I can still run all the way up here and absolutely break enemy melee, right? Bring up here, pull back Deadly Aim a little bit, go for Aura of Conviction for more pierce resistance, took 20 points away from this. And I still really like to run this, right? If you want to take a couple of points away from Blade Spirit instead to put them into Deadly Aim, you can do that. I don't mind Blade Spirits on Nightblade here, primarily because we are converting some of that cold damage to pierce damage. It has some pierce damage by itself. It has bleeding damage. Again, this is something you summon. Your melee, this is fine, right? They don't have a time limit. These just exist, right? So I like these with melee, with the dual wielding. Remember, we are getting a lot of... You can actually see right there, we're getting like 9 extra skill points on this bad boy. This is one of the few builds I'll run Blade Spirit on. This just turns out fantastically. So I am really fond of this. You'll notice I don't run Heartseeker here. If you do want to run Heartseeker, you might have to sacrifice Deadly Aim, or maybe you sacrifice Ring of Steel or Circle of Slaughter, your choice. But what I can say at an absolute minimum, again, I want to go back to what I always minimally build. Alright? At an absolute minimum, I run this. This is my absolute minimum. Deadly Aim, Dual Blades, Belgothian Shears, Phantasmal Blades, Pneumatic Burst with Breath of Belgothian. A lot of times I run Shadow Dance. I'll put the points in it. You don't necessarily need that. Again, if this is hardcore, absolute necessity. Veil of Shadow, Night's Chill. Whether you use Death Sentence for the Pierce Resistance, whether you go all the way to... Whether you use the Ring of Steel, Horn of Gandar combo, whether you go up to Aura of Conviction, all totally your preference. But this is the minimum I run with. We'll take this out, because Shadow Dance is only really necessary on hardcore. This is the minimum I run with. Alright? I still like the melee breaking combo on this. I love Blade Spirit on this. Alright? And by the way, running Blade Spirit with the melee breaking combo just means that enemies are sitting around getting absolutely decimated by your Blade Spirits, which is a lovely time. And if you stack the Living Shadows on top of that, things get out of control very quickly. That's a gross combination I don't hear enough people talking about. But this is still very effective. The problem really, once again, comes down to the fact, and this is, again, why it's my least favorite, we're only getting 40% armor piercing here, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, my approach to the devotion for the dual wielding is identical to the two-handed melee. Alright, I run the same constellation skills. I still prefer Blades of Wrath over the Shifting Sands with the dual wielding. I almost always build Living Shadow over the Falcons, so I will say that. I will admit that. I almost never Falcon with the dual wielding. I'm more likely to use it with the two-handed melee, but with the dual wielding, it's almost always Living Shadow, because they just... Having a bunch of Living Shadows and Blade Storms running around, Blade Spirits, excuse me, running around, killing things next to you, is just absolutely fantastic. It really is. But this is how these are the 3 primary builds I run when running Pierce Infiltrator. Alright. I have another episode planned on this particular conversation, but this is how I typically approach Pierce Infiltrator. So, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.